Welcome to the San Diego Psychological Association's podcast, Diving into Healing. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Carcel. This podcast has been developed with the intent to inform and educate the general public and providers and should not be relied upon for any other purpose. The content, views, and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speaker and not those of the San Diego Psychological Association. On today's show, we will be discussing navigating the twin pandemics, COVID and racial inequality. I'm happy to introduce our expert and guest, Dr. Ricky Pope. Welcome, Dr. Pope, and thank you so much for being on the show.
Michelle, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm so excited to talk to you. This topic, I think, it can resonate on so many levels. But before we jump in, I'd love to hear more about your background and how you became interested in psychology and becoming a psychologist yourself.
Absolutely. Okay. Becoming a psychologist, I actually had no intention of going to college. Went to community college here, San Diego Mesa College, and I was able to meet a woman. Her name's Jay Van Kirk, and she's just a phenomenal woman. She was the advisor for this organization called Psi Beta, the National Honor Society, and best $50 I ever spent in my life. And so I paid my dues. There's all these flyers and opportunities about things. And so I work on my personal statement. It's read. She revised it a couple of times, maybe 5 or more, right? And so just getting the writing up the par, but I get approved for this grant to go to Washington, D.C., and I meet ethnic minority psychologists for the first time. And I see folks, and I'm like, oh man, like I could do that. I could be a psychologist and done. And I was ready to go. And so there's been some other folks, right? It's a long journey to get there, but I think that was one of the pivotal experiences that made it possible to be able to pursue psychology.
That's wonderful. And one of the things that you brought up that I think is important to share too is identifying with other people that are in our field. As myself, I identify as a Latina psychologist. I didn't have anybody that I knew in my family. There was nobody that I could speak to that I could identify with in this field. And kind of a similar story, I started getting into, psychology and looking at it from a lens that was from my background. And I did meet a Latina psychologist, and it really helped kind of solidify my decision to go in. So I like that we have that parallel piece to this, and I think that's really significant for anybody listening who, if you love something but you don't have that role model, you don't have that connection. There are people out there that we can find and hopefully connect to. So I love that. I think that's really great.
Absolutely, I agree. I'm a big proponent of sending students to conferences. I feel like that's where the magic happens. Like you meet folks, you see, okay, like that theory resonates with me, right? And they're all the way on the other side of the country, but you're finding those folks, and once you get into the community of psychology and mental health, right? It's a small community.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And, now kind of segueing a little bit here, I think being an identified Black psychologist, is that how you identify yourself?
Correct.
Yes. And then the last year that we had, oh my goodness, I think 2020 felt like a tipping point in many ways.
I absolutely agree with you 100%. Like it felt like, there's something about 2020 and just how everything unfolded with COVID. But then, June with the buildup with George Floyd and, several other cases that were, happening then. But it just was like, did I see this? Is that what I just witnessed? Right. Like just definitely
Right.
a moment for the nation to pause and really the world
Yeah.
to pause.
Yeah, I like that we can talk about it in a context of twin pandemics. I think that is such an appropriate term because it really was, and it felt like to me with the racial inequality and justice piece of it, it was just one after another after another. And it's interesting because there are names that stick out. So we think of George Floyd, we think of Breonna Taylor. But there's Andre Hill, there's Rashad Brooks, there's all of these different. I could name on,
Yeah, yeah,
and it was a tipping point.
yeah.
And then combined with COVID, it felt so detrimental.
Yeah, and I think what COVID did, right? Like it allowed us, like holistic, like all of us to pause, like right, like our worlds were slowed down, and so then you're seeing it across your social media feeds, you're seeing it on the news, And it's just like, wow, is this really happening,
Mhm.
in our country? Because I think folks who are at the table talking about topics of racism and oppression, right, been having these conversations, but now here was an invitation, to the whole country, right, and now we got to come back to work or work virtually, and now we have to deal with this because it felt like it was, his case, George Floyd's case in particular, was very prominent,
Mhm.
and it was like, okay, we got to have some
Mhm.
conversations.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think let's start with this and defining the twin pandemics. I think that might help us kind of segue into how this has impacted our society and how we can find healing. But I think let's just start here. How would you define when you say twin pandemic? I mean, it sounds logical based on our conversation, but yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, and so it feels like something that just kind of grew out of what folks were talking about, like this idea of twin pandemics, and it intuitively makes sense being, alive at this time. But right, like this idea of responding to a public health crisis while also navigating, systemic racism, racial inequality. And so you even think like zooming out of just the Black community, the whole idea of stop Asian hate, right? And so that's definitely at the intersection of the twin pandemics. Also, like a lot of folks who are doing this research and education on systemic racism and anti-racism, right, been having these conversations. So this idea of a twin pandemic is not new, right? Like this idea of dealing with racial inequality, that conversation's been happening, but just something about just with COVID, the pause, people are at home, people are trying to consume, stuff and media and things to occupy their time. And so I think that's what really sparked these deeper conversations. And, there's a lot of release of literature and people wanting information to know how to respond and come back to their organizations and be able to move forward, as organizations, as communities.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. And I'm curious for you, what did you experience in navigating this racial social injustice and also the protests during the time of quarantine last year? How was it for you and for people that you work with, your population?
No, absolutely. So just I think with the college students, right, their lives were uprooted in a sense because it felt like we're going to be on campus. Then oh wait, well, we're not going to be on campus. And so like right, like a lot of 2020 and 2021 has been about being adaptive and being able to anticipate like there's going to be changes, right? Like we don't know how we're going to do this, right? The last time there was a global pandemic, right, 100 years ago. So it's like, how do we do this? And also having some grace and compassion, like because we're trying to figure this out. But I mean, I think like a lot of the work that I was doing on the campus at that time was racial, co-leading racial healing circles or anti-racist discussions with different organizations and departments on the campus, and giving students and faculty and staff the opportunity to just talk about what's going on and how they're feeling and how like what kind of departments and organizations and like those smaller communities, like how do we want to exist. And then I think that's what 2021 has been, right? Like as we open up, like I've done some return to work stuff, return to campus stuff, and so it's like how do you return to work, return to campus, like are we elbow bumping, are we bowing, do we do hugs, like, and like how do I ask those questions? Everyone's thinking the same thing, and so really just trying to be, have informal conversations with folks about like how do we do this. And I think a big one, right, like this idea of coming to work, even if I'm sick, I'm dedicated, so I'm going to be there, right? And no, stay home, please don't come to work. And so I gave a presentation, and I mean, one of the faculty really hit that point home, right? Because I'm like, okay, like I was role playing, right, as a psychologist, and so like, hey, like, well, teacher, what if I, professor, what if I need, my practicum hours? Like, you want me to? I want to be dedicated to the, to my work. No, stay home. Don't come to campus. Don't go to your practicum, right? And so I think just really like shifting those informal norms because we have these policies and procedures, but then like, okay, but really, how do we do this? Please go rest. Please go take care of yourself. Don't come to
Mhm.
work. And just, really deciding how we want to do that.
Right. And for clarification, you are a psychologist at SDSU, San Diego State University. And when I said earlier the population you work with, it's primarily college students, but also a diverse population,
So
right?
now
A
you're gonna get
diverse
me
population.
you're gonna get me in trouble. So anytime I think
Uh-oh.
about my work, right, I love working with college students, and I always joke
Yes.
and say like I have the best job in America. And it's not a joke. I mean, it's real. Uh so I get to work with a group of kids who are ready to figure out their lives and their potentials, right? And so even though things are hard and it doesn't seem clear like of what they're going to do and how they're going to do it, right, but just kind of piecing that together and figuring it out and tapping into their potential, their purpose, their meaning, their unique gifts and talents, right, like that's the work I get to do every day. And so yeah, no, it's really good work.
Oh, that's yeah, I agree. I also have that opportunity, and I think I do it in private practice, but I also work with young adults a lot, and it's wonderful. I really love that there's still curiosity. I hate to I'm going to age myself a little bit, but I think sometimes I forget to be curious at my age, right? And at that age, as a young adult, there's still curiosity about things, and I hope that we never lose that, no matter what age we're at. But it can be really great. And I think again, kind of going back to just how difficult navigating COVID and navigating all of the socio-political cultural components of the past year and a half. I'm sure you saw quite a bit. And I think that's where your knowledge comes in for anybody who's listening. Maybe we can talk a little bit about how that's impacted, young adults all the way up to anyone who had to suffer and watch through that. It was pretty remarkable. All of the mental health outcomes that came from COVID and also from the racial social injustice that we saw. You actually teach a course at SDSU called Bounce Back. Do you talk about these topics there as well?
Absolutely. I find like in all of the courses that I teach, it's really what pertains to what's going on with students. So there's always space for processing in these courses. But Bounce Back was created by the counseling center, and so I'm just privileged to be able to teach the course. And so really, it's working with students who are at risk academically and helping them bounce back with their grades and being able to retain them. So why I love Bounce Back is sometimes you get students from all walks of life, right? It could be you had stuff going on at home, and that's interfering with your ability to perform and focus fully on your coursework, grief, all those things of life that just happen. Is life doesn't care that you're in college, right? And so those things that just kind of occur that interrupt. So typically I get those students who something happened and now their grades have been influenced by that. And there can be some shame, and so really like a lot of it is just talking about, no, these things happen. The university builds in ways to help people get through those issues, like, with course forgiveness in the bounce back course, right? Like it's about resiliency, grit, right? Getting people to turn on and tap into their purpose and tap into their meaning. And so I'm not the only psychologist or mental health
Mm.
practitioner that works and teaches the course. So it's a team of us. That way we can have a broad reach. But it's one of my favorite courses to teach, simply, because of what education has meant to my life. And I can tell you more about what it's meant.
Oh, I wanna know. Oh, we're gonna get into Ricky, I'm excited to talk to you about your past and your present. But I just wanted to add to that I think every university, if they don't have something like this, could really benefit from a program like this because especially again, I keep reflecting on the past 18 months. We were not prepared for this. This is not something that not even our community as mental health professionals were we prepared for the type of impact that this had on everyone, including us, especially medical providers. Again, it's been a year and a half, and it's definitely important that we all kind of formulate some type of protocol now to make sure that we're on top of anyone who is suffering, and I think it would be really good for us to talk about that in the context of both COVID and the racial injustice. But I want to come back to what you just said. Please share your story too. I mean, there's a lot I think that you can give us some wisdom here from your own experiences.
I would just say one is this idea of expectations. And so, the expectations we have for ourselves, the expectations others have for us. And so I think at different stages throughout my life, having lower expectations for what I could do one day. And so, like, K through 12, I had some ideas. Like, I was going to play football and go to the NFL, and that didn't happen, right? And so, so then I'm working, in the community here, trying to figure it out. And my mom, she just was in my head, like, "Hey, you're smart. Go to college. Think, what about college?" I'm like, "College? I don't know about college." So I remember going to Mesa College and signing up for this philosophy course. And people were having conversations, and they're like talking about like existence, the meaning of life, like happiness, and they're debating. And it was so fascinating to me. And I'm like, wait, this is college? Right? Like, I had this whole idea of what it was gonna be. And so, I mean, I ended up with the B in the course, and then I had to go take my GED during that summer in order to get financial aid and fully enroll in the spring. So wow. So there's education, right? And so then at SDSU, being a transfer student, it's different to start out at community college. It's small, then you transfer into the big university. So I get those students as well, like in bounce back. They transferred in, and it was hard to find their path. And now, I'd say semester after semester, there's increasingly more programming on campus to support transfer students and commuter students. But and I stopped telling people the year I graduated, right? Because that dates me. But back when I was there at SDSU, I ended up on academic probation, just working and trying to navigate something different than community college. And so it was just a lot of change and transition. And so, I definitely have been where my students have been. And so just really trying to reduce that shame and note that if they didn't have the potential to be in the university, they wouldn't have been there anyway. And so really working with them to recognize that, and just that this is a temporary setback and you're going to bounce back and be resilient and be able to show up in the world the way you want to show up. And so, I mean, I live that. And so I know it's possible. And so really just working with them to see those possibilities and to raise those expectations for themselves.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah, I completely agree. And I love that you said the word resilience because I think that it's important that all of us recognize we have that potential to consistently have resilience as long as we can continuously work through the underlying tenets that keep us, let's say, held back,
Hmm.
whatever
Hmm. Hmm.
that is
Yeah,
for
whatever
each
those
individual.
barriers, yeah, whether they're internal barriers or systemic barriers, right?
That's
But
right.
just being able to, and I think that's why the podcast is so important, and just being able to tell stories and hear other folks' stories. And
Hmm.
so as you hear these narratives, you hear these stories, I don't know. I guess the way I think about it is new degrees of freedom, right? Like as you, oh wow, like I met a black male psychologist. Wow, that's something that I can put that in my brain, a schema, right? Like, and
Yeah,
I can be a psychologist too, right? Like, it's
right.
just like I think that this is such an important format to share
Mhm.
ideas and narratives with folks. So thank you for having me here.
Oh, no, thank you for coming. No, I agree. I think that was one of the reasons that I was excited to do this too. And honestly, I'm still kind of like shocked that I'm hosting, here and there. It's like what? It's a true
Yeah,
privilege. I feel so
yeah, yeah.
honored to do this, and it's just wonderful. And I think for me, and I was actually just talking to our producer Tammy about this today. I think to be able to share knowledge is the goal, right? To make sure that people who listen understand that you're not alone. There's different topics that we talk about every week. We're trying to get out information because at the end of the day, navigating life it's hard. It's really hard. And especially when you have barriers. I'm glad you used that word. And I think kind of going back to the racial and social injustice. One thing I really like, you talk about a community or institutional rupture. You mentioned that you have a couple of videos out on YouTube, so I'm going to plug you a little bit here because I loved watching you. I loved what you were talking about, and one of them is called 7 a.m. ish, and in you actually talk about a situation that happened to you February of this year of 2021. And it has the irony of it, if I may just kind of set the tone and of what happened was that you were going in to teach a class on racism and you actually had something happen to you while going to work and having this experience and all of this on the heels of 2020 and leading into 2021, when we were still not out of the woods with the pandemic. We were still dealing with the terrible, hardships of 2020 and the protests, and still that bleeding into 2021, all necessary. It's important that we advocate, but I think what might be good is for you to share your story and talk about healing, because you went on to another piece where you talked about how to heal from these experiences. And sometimes I feel like that gets lost in the anger and the muck. And I agree, we have reasons. Everybody needs to be angry about injustice. I mean, and anger is an umbrella emotion for pain, right? We feel anger, but at the heart of it is hurt.
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd be really helpful to hear what you experienced and how that actually led to healing, because I think we can talk about that more in a general sense and for people listening and for the general population.
Wow. Okay. So February, because I mean, it feels like, 2021, so much has happened. And so it just feels like that was so long ago, in a way, but it wasn't, right? It was, it was this year.
Yeah.
But let's see. So I was going into work on a Friday morning. It was sometime really early in the morning, earlier than I typically go in. And so I was going to be presenting at Teachers College. It was a presentation for a difficult dialogue. It was called Elephant in the Nation: Race, Racism, and Human Relations. And so on my way in, I'm going across Hardy, and I don't know, like SDSU, like it's a place that's home for me. My son had just been born in October 23rd. I was coming back to campus and walking across Hardy, and I just remember looking up, you know, at the office where I work, and just saying, man, like I have the greatest job, in America. I get to, work with students and help them, overcome things that have happened to me. So it's just a significant place for me. So walking in, right, to have folks question, if I should be on campus, and to have the police ultimately called because they thought I was suspicious. And so interacting with officers, that early in the morning, on a day when I was gonna be presenting on the topic of race, racism, and human relations, was just a really interesting experience. And so when I even gave the presentation that day, I just still gave the presentation, and so it was very emotional and intense. But folks really got a lot out of it because they needed they needed to talk about these things. And so one of the audience members was an international practicing mental health person, uh, said, if I would have known that America was like this, I would have never came. And I just like that just stood with me. And but then lots of folks thanking me for you know, being able to talk about and give them space to talk about the microaggressions and systemic issues that are happening in their organizations or on their campuses. And so one of the critical things that happened, and for me, and I think why I was able to heal in the way that I've been able to heal from this specific incident was that folks believe me and believe that this happened. And so there's this emerging concept called racial gaslighting, to where when racial ethnic minority folks talk about things, no, people don't believe them or say, well, why are you bringing that up, right? And just treat everybody the same. And so this is like, it stymies conversation. And so I feel like in my instances, like the senior level leadership, they acknowledge what happened. And so that allowed me to say, okay, like I don't have to spend this first part of this trying to prove that something happened. So I think that was healing in the sense that it was acknowledged, I was believed, uh, and then it was just an outpouring of support and love from family and friends and folks who had went through similar experiences. And so what I realized for me, uh, and it was really only a split moment, because like I said, the officers were well trained. They treated me with dignity and respect. I don't even know, I think I was on a rant. I was telling, I got a presentation today, and I was like really agitated, right? And so they were like, okay, you're an expert of this, go back to your office, like they were really this is the work you do. Go give your presentation. So they were trying to, encourage me to really de-escalate things. And so, but because of the context that we live in, right, 2020, 2021, and the generations prior, for a split second, I'm like, man, like I could not be here, and really had to contend with my own mortality in a different kind of way. And so I don't know. I think it was like, so then I don't know if it felt like a calling, or if I was just really, that's the way I would have described it 6 months ago. Like, I feel like it's a calling to do deeper work in this area, but I feel like I've been doing the work. So I don't know if it was like you really need to do some more work in this area. Like, I don't know what that was, but I feel like just being confronted with mortality, and my son is turning 2 in October. But it was like I wanted to hear a conversation with him. And in that moment, I remember sitting there in my office and just thinking, like, man, like, if something would have happened, I haven't even heard him put words together yet. And so, yeah. So it does feel like a calling. It does feel like there's more to do in this area. And I think the critical piece for me is about the human relations component. Like, how do we relate together? Because as a psychologist, as you know, Michelle, vocational psychology, right? Like, like we spend a ton of time in the world of work, right? We sometimes it feels like we spend more time with our coworkers than, well, I hope it doesn't feel that way, but it can feel that way, right? And so then what kind of, or like, it's like this organization is going to sustain you, like you're giving places life, like your life. And so, this idea of being treated with dignity and respect, being able to have a sense of purpose and meaning. And so I think race is one of those things that are so uncomfortable to talk about, but it does influence one's sense of belonging. And so it's like, we got to have these conversations. It's uncomfortable, but come on, let's do it. And so I think art is healing. And I also did take a day at the beach with my daughter and connect with nature. And that's something that's come from COVID, right? Like, I got plants now, and that's all because of COVID. And so I think, like, COVID and the twin pandemics has been a challenge to navigate for all of us in society. Uh, but I think it's opened up new ways of relating to self and others. And so now I'm talking to plants, right? I'm more connected to nature. I've learned that I need to specify. If someone invites you for a hike, you need to specify what level of hike you're going on, right? Because I went on a hike, they had boots, camel pack. I'm like, we're just going on a walk, right? We're not climbing anybody's mountain. And so, yeah, so no, it's definitely opened up time in a different way.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. And I want to go back for a second just to kind of clarify. We're talking about two very big topics, so I'm gonna try my best to kind of summarize a little bit in a few seconds or less, however I can do this. But when we were talking about your story, I just want to share that you were targeted based on your appearance, and that happens more than we care to admit. And after 2020 and kind of experiencing this again tipping point, it's not that this hasn't been going on forever. It has. It's just that the knowledge, the awareness, and with technology, now we're seeing it, we're viewing it, we're hearing it. And it just happened so much in succession in combination with COVID, where anxiety was already high, stressors were already high, isolation, depression. We saw things spike in a way we've never seen spike before. And
Hmm.
then to boot, you're adding this whole other level of this injustice that's occurring. And yes, primarily we're focusing on our talk today on African American population, but it also was happening to Latinx population as well. You're seeing kids in cages. You're seeing children be separated from their families,
Mm,
which to
mm.
me still I get very emotional when I talk about that or think about it. And then of course the Asian hate and all these terrible things. It was just too much, too fast, too everything. And I think it might be helpful for us to talk about how all of these things, it's okay to not be okay. I kind of love that Michael Phelps floated that recently. And I think a lot of people have been talking about that and putting it in a summary. And that, how do we heal?
Mm, mm,
How do we fix it?
mhm.
How do we? deal with this, and COVID being the anxiety, the depression, all of the exacerbation. We saw substance abuse rise. We saw all these different things. That's one topic. And then the social injustice, which has a very personal meaning for a lot of us. And yeah, like I know I'm asking a huge question here, but
No, I think like so. There's this longitudinal study that I'm sure you've heard of, the Harvard
oh
study,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Where they talk
great
about
study.
the high quality relation. Yes, yes. So the relationships. I think that's it. So one of the things that sustained me through this is a weekly men's group that I'm in, and so we've been meeting weekly over Zoom. The whole time, and there's folks there that haven't missed one Wednesday. So it's just like to be able to have community and relationships, and I think technology affords us that where we can do that. But that's that. Uh, yeah, no, that's a broad question, but I definitely feel like it's definitely community and relationships, having space for conversation like how we're having, and engaging in dialogue across difference, which is scary and hard and not always like I guess what I'm realizing, like right, like it's to facilitate some of these conversations. It's a skill and an art, and so like getting the training as a psychologist to be able to run a group and hold all of that cognitive energy and the pacing and all that. That's a skill. And so really wanting to make sure like those conversations are facilitated, correctly, and that they happen, right? Because you don't want to wound and hurt people. Um, so I would say that as well would be something I would think is important to open up space to have these conversations, right? Like this, one of my mentors would talk about undying dedication to reality, and so it's like we're seeing this stuff on video. People are having these conversations. What like how do we deal with it and to deal with it?
I completely agree, and I love what you took out of this, and one of the things that I think is really important is, given the tipping point again of 2020 and all of these things coming to a head, how scary, how real it got in that moment to be targeted based on your appearance and to be questioned despite the fact that you are a doctor in psychology and that is you're going to work, and this happened on the heels of all of this other tragedy that we have had
Hmm.
to see, witness, experience.
Hmm.
I mean, gosh, I can't even imagine. But what I love is how you put in perspective of a calling, how you've put in perspective of healing, and I like that you said conversation and relationship. I think, when we're talking about solutions to not only COVID and racial inequality, but in general, we've got to look at how we are feeling, how we are approaching things, and what we can do educationally to grow in these ways. And first and foremost, I want to acknowledge that it's okay to be angry. It's okay to be hurt. And anger is that umbrella emotion for pain. Anger
Hmm.
is the front line to say something is wrong and someone has wronged me or something happened and I have this right. But underneath it is the more important piece. We can't get stuck in anger,
Hmm.
because when you get stuck in anger, then we see hatred, we see fear, we see contempt, and we lose the ability to have the real, healthy, genuine connection conversations, even if we disagree with each other, right? So the goal here, I think, is going from that anger to where you went, which was healing and
Hmm.
opportunity,
Hmm. Hmm.
and recognizing, okay, this hurt, so what can I do about it? What do I need to do about it?
Hmm.
And I think I'd like to ask you a little bit about that too, because a lot of times I think people feel lost when it comes to the twin pandemics, when it comes to what happened with COVID. We're starting to see a swing now. We're starting to see things opening up, but with Delta variant,
Hmm.
there's so much conflict. It's polarized almost now, and that's just sad, right? That just doesn't work.
Hmm.
But we could talk about this from both the racial inequality in the pandemic. So I think maybe let's talk about healing solutions. I'm curious for you, what's worked for you?
Hmm. Yeah.
And then we could talk about maybe your students and grow from there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would say specific to this incident and just specific to the way that this kind of unfolded for me, because I'm aware that other folks have had similar incidents, is uh, with racial bias and discrimination, and those things may go different, right? And so this is specifically mostly pertaining to like how things kind of played out for me, and so I just want to make sure that I don't say like, okay, this is what everybody needs to do, right? Because all of this is so unique, right? It's so complex. Uh, how to respond to incidents that happen. Uh, but I would say for me, like the taking a reparative model, and so being able to talk with folks. So like uh, you know when when it happened and it took a while to get there, but being able to sit down with the folks that had made the call, right? And then that was, I mean, I promise you that was just so healing, because I was able to hear like their perspective, they were able to hear mine, uh, and we were able to get to a point of healing. And so that's why I do think of it as like a rupture in the family or an institutional rupture. And so like, when things that happen in a family, right? Like you got to deal with it. You just can't quit your family. Well, I mean, maybe you can, but right, like you don't quit your family and just go start all over somewhere else, right? It's like how do we heal that rupture? And so I think in our organizations that we're part of, right? It can be like a family or like a system. And so if there's a rupture, how do we want those ruptures to be healed and handled? And I guess my argument would be for nuance, so for a system that can respond with nuance and complexity versus like a legalistic model or an avoidance model. Like, can you think about the human component and those human relationships? And in this particular case, as it was for me, I felt like whether that was Dr. Croto, the interplay between privilege and oppression, and just being Dr. Pope gave me the opportunity to be able to articulate what it is that I wanted and needed to feel okay. But as a psychologist, when I think about trauma, when I think about hard stuff, you have to talk about it. And as folks talk about it, right, like those things, like the weight of that, it decreases. And so being able to just talk about what happened and have people willing to listen, having people believe what happened, I think that has been healing. And then all of the performers, the rising heroes that were touched by the story and shared their art, their music, their talents. Yeah, I just feel blessed to be a part of a San Diego community and a group of folks, from all different backgrounds and skills and talents to be able to help me and support me.
No, that's wonderful. And I'm glad you're putting it in the relational context again. I think that that's so important. And I think for anybody listening where maybe you've experienced something, whether it's COVID and you feel isolated and you feel conflicted, and as things are opening up, I think we're seeing a little bit less of the isolation. But maybe there's family members that disagree with your position on this. Maybe there's things that you're concerned about, or and someone else isn't, and you're seeing conflict, or however this is coming up for you, that talking about it helps because it gives you an opportunity to bounce your ideas and your thoughts off somebody and see how you're feeling about it, right? So I think relationships matter. And for those who are experiencing actual mental health symptoms, whether it's anxiety, we've seen a spike, like I said, in everything. We've seen a spike in anxiety, depression, stress response. We've seen trauma from this, substance abuse and use. You may want to actually meet with a mental health professional and see what coping skills, what tools that can help you. I think a misconception, and maybe Ricky, you and I can talk to this a little bit too, is in minority populations, education on psychology and mental health is sparse. Would you agree with me on that?
I think the conversation is picking up,
Yeah,
but
I
yeah,
agree.
absolutely, and it's taboo, right?
Right.
Like it's this idea of you're putting all your business in the streets,
Yeah.
right? And so yeah, so no, but like I mean, I've given the last 20 years to this training and mental health, and it's just been like an invaluable resource that has been provided to me to work on myself and my own growth, but then to pass that on to other folks and to be able to be that instrument for other people's growth. And so I think that I feel like the secret's out. right?
Yeah,
Like
I agree.
but maybe it's generational because I work with these young folks. And so, like, I mean, I've had young folks want to post on Facebook and TikTok and Instagram about like their mental health and what and I'm like, well, maybe you don't want to put that on social media, right? And so, like, so like, but the like my parents' generation, and less talking about
Yeah,
mental health,
yeah,
and so I think there's a shift, and I think COVID too, the twin pandemics, right? Like, because like people are hurting, people are isolated. So now I have like grandmas and aunties, and they're on a Zoom meeting with us, and so we had like a family Zoom meeting, and so I think they're jumping aboard. And with telehealth, I think it makes mental health more accessible
yeah.
to folks, and you can find if you're looking for a clinician of color, you can find that, or someone who specializes in multiculturalism. It's just more accessible now
Mhm.
with telehealth. So
I agree with that, and thank you for clarifying, because when I was saying that earlier, I think part of it is the generational, what I was referring to, so I'm glad you clarified that. I agree with you. I'm so happy to see the conversation spreading. I think it's exciting to be able to talk about this, and not only talk about it from the perspective of our education, but recognizing that, even in psychology and in different fields, a lot of the education came from the dominant culture, right? The theories were coming from, the dominant culture, not from oppressive and racial cultures that had experienced a different space. And we're seeing models, identity models, that I think are really covering this and really talking about what experience is it for a Black person versus a Latinx person versus an Asian person versus a white person. And there is white identity, there is Black identity, there is, and it's also in context of here in the United States versus another place. So I just think all of these things, it's just such an exciting time to see this paradigm shift. And that's really wonderful. And I think, kind of going back to healing, it's the resources are out there. There's we're talking about it, and there's all types of wonderful readings and things and literature. And if you don't know where to find them, that's where hopefully, somebody like you or like myself, we can point people in the right direction. A lot of times I think there's a misconception, like you said, just kind of putting it all out there and talking about your business, and I don't feel comfortable doing that. Well, a lot of this is also talking about how to cope, how to deal with it, how to understand and label your emotions in the moment, how to recognize, this is how I feel right now about this, and this is what I can do about it. Where I don't know about you, Ricky, but I didn't know how to
yeah,
do that.
no, yeah,
I didn't know how to do any of that before
yeah,
this,
yeah,
right?
absolutely, yeah,
Yeah. So I think that's a big broad piece of why mental health is so important, and recognizing where we are with it.
absolutely. No, I 100% agree. Like uh, just being able to get support, get help, have someone to provide that empathy for you, right? But even as a psychologist, like you mentioned it earlier, Michelle, like we weren't trained for this, right? Like of how to respond to this. And I remember, the when the decision was made for everything to go virtual, and it was like, well, how are we going to offer therapy, right? How do we even do that? And so, and it hadn't been done before. And so quickly, right, to be able to work from home and to buy cameras and to get everything going, now I think that's a part of I think it's here to stay, right? Like the
Yeah.
and so I think that's the positive out of this for me. Like, right, like there's just more
Yeah.
opportunities for folks to tell their stories and to make meaning of it. And I think the gift of working with a psychologist, a counselor, someone who's trained as a therapist, right, is to be able to reframe. Like I'm thinking narratively here, but to be able to reframe folk stories, because right, it's the way stories are told and heard, and so to be able to tell these stories in new ways to provide new degrees of freedoms, I think that's the gift that therapists and psychologists do. Well, it makes perfect sense. That's what you did in your family of origin, but now this is your life. What do you want to do now? This is I never thought about it that right, and to be able to give people new ways to make sense out of how they see themselves and others.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm glad you brought up, again, the positive of this, the healing, because a lot of times I think as we talk about the COVID, and we talk about the past 18 months and the racial injustice piece of this, it can get mucked up with just again, not feeling heard, not feeling understood. And that's fair. I think all of those feelings and thoughts are completely valid. It's how do we get to a healing place? And I think that's the part where I hope anybody listening, there are solutions to this. And anything from, rituals that you've learned, the silver lining with COVID, like you were saying earlier,
Yeah.
going out to the
Yeah.
beach
Yeah.
and experiencing things with
Yeah.
your family, and
Yeah. Oh yeah.
even if you're religious,
Yeah.
having your religious institutions be a part of it, going to exercise and getting out your frustrations that way, or learning what anxiety actually is, that it is actually much more than just the jitters. It's a sympathetic response to fear and pain and maybe underlying trauma, and the more we know and educate ourselves, the better. And I think that overall is if I'm hearing you right, it's really been a lot of that for you. Is that right?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I tried boxing, and so it was good to do that, and it was a different skill that I hadn't tried that before, and so that was helpful. Like, so it prompted me to try some new things. Uh, COVID and just this year, I would say the plants in my house now, the boxing and the beach walks have been
Mhm.
phenomenal. The hikes, but really have to specify like level 1, 2. Like I'm gonna make it to level 3 and 4. I did make it up the backside of Cow's Mountain, and so
Oh,
I was I was
impressive.
I was quite proud of myself. Quite tired, but proud. And so yeah, just connecting with nature and discovering as like parts of San Diego, that I hadn't necessarily been to yet. And so it's been that part of it's good, right? Like it's hard, like when you want to go to your favorite restaurant or you want to do this thing, this tradition you always do, and it's closed, and or there's barriers, or you had to make reservations and now you can't go, right? Like those parts are hard, but
Yeah.
but also seeing the pieces, the extra time that I did get to spend with the kids from working at home and being able to run in there and cook something and play Legos for a little bit, right? Like those parts, and just kind of treasuring those moments.
So thank you again, Ricky, for being here. I look forward to our next conversation.
I can't wait.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
The information and advice offered is not intended to treat or diagnose and is not meant to replace any other professional consultation. If you'd like to know more about the San Diego Psychological Association, go to our website at sdpsych.org. That's sdpsych.org. Thank you so much for tuning in. Until next time, take care of yourself and be well.